Baie dankie Piet. En môre dames en here. Welkom by KragDag 22. Dis die laaste dag van KragDag, dis die besigste dag. En ons waardeer al die besoekers en die uitstellers wat hierdie geleentheid so suksesvol en waardevol maak. En ek wil ook dankie sê aan vir die KragDag organisering komitee, dis HP Stein en dis Dion en Sonay en die hele span van KragDag. Groot dankie om te sê van Sakeliege se kant af en ook baie dankie vir my kollegas by Sakeliege. Dis almal wat baie hard gewerk het om hierdie geleentheid te reël. Karen en Sonika en Moira, baie dankie julle. En diegene wat so baie werk gedoen het. Gister was daar 'n toespraak en 'n paneelbespreking oor die verengelsing van die Afrikaanse universiteite. En vandag sien ons 'n klein verengelsing van die sprekerprogram, want ek gaan my toespraak in Engels doen, in Engels hou. Maar goed, die volgende toesprake is weer in Afrikaans. In die suiwer Afrikaans van Piet Leroux en Gideon Joubert en Driekus Kombrink. Maar goed. So, why should we care about a place called Sri Lanka? Sometimes we play cricket against them, and sometimes we win, and sometimes they win. But some of you might have noticed extraordinary scenes in Sri Lanka. How many of you have seen on social media tens of thousands of Sri Lankans storming the presidential palace in the last few weeks? Have you noticed that? Maybe you were focusing on your own things here. I was looking at some of that. And Sri Lanka is in economic and political chaos. The president has had to flee the country, and I think he's in Thailand now, in Bangkok. He hasn't resigned, but he's fled the country in fear of his life. And Sri Lankans have stormed the presidential palace, and there's chaos in the streets. And of course, when we see this, that's the Sri Lankan economy over there. When we see this, we sort of think, well, okay, there's something going on in the country over there. But it's a little bit like if people were to see what happened in KwaZulu-Natal last year. How does that suddenly just happen? And they probably saw it on their news channels in England, and then they thought, okay, they carry on with their lives. But it actually there's so much that happens to build up to these sorts of events. And they're not just events where the currency crashes or weakens. They're not just events where the stock market goes down. They're not just events where interest rates go up. Those have real-world implications. But what we're seeing in Sri Lanka are major shortages of key goods. We're seeing a rise in hunger and malnutrition. Sri Lankans, one in four Sri Lankans are having to skip meals every day because they can't get enough food. Food prices in Sri Lanka this year have doubled. Just doubled in a few weeks. Imagine going into the store this weekend to get ready for the rugby tonight, and you're going to buy your things and everything's double the price. So food prices have doubled. The currency has almost halved in value overnight last month. Imagine waking up on Monday morning and the rand isn't 17 or 16 to the dollar, it's 30. Imagine the shock that would be for importers. Imagine how that would push prices up of things that we buy from overseas. So a major economic crisis is unfolding in Sri Lanka. The state-owned electricity company in Sri Lanka. Ring any bells? Something similar here, but the state-owned electricity company in Sri Lanka is asking for they've been granted a 300% price increase. But they wanted an 800% price increase. Okay. So we can see some shadows and echoes of what's going on there as to what might go on in South Africa. So that's that's what the country faces. Major foreign exchange shortages, shortages of fuel, food, and hunger on the rise, and protests now erupting across the streets. So how did Sri Lanka get to this point? This is something that could take many hours to explain, but I'll try and do it in about 2 minutes, or 2 or 3 minutes. But Sri Lanka has a very troubled history. It was a British colony. When the British left in the early 70s, what arose from that was ethnic tensions within Sri Lanka between the majority population of Sri Lankans and the Tamil people. You might have heard of the Tamil Tigers, a separatist group in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka had a 30-year civil war that ended in about 2009 with the deaths of tens of thousands of people. Sri Lanka's got about 20 million people. People estimate that that war cost about 100,000 lives. South Africa's got 60 million. So it would be like a war in South Africa where about 300,000 people died. Now, in some ways, South Africa, since over the last 30 years, has had a different kind of war. Violent crime has been terrible in this country, and estimates suggest that South Africa has lost something like 400,000 or 500,000 people to violent crime in the last 30 or so years. South Africa has its own political tensions, not exactly the same as Sri Lanka, but it has its own political and ethnic difficulties. Out of that end of that civil war in 2009, the government now had to try and hold together this fragile peace. And when governments have to try and hold a fragile peace together, they generally start to resort to misbehaving, to taking economic shortcuts. Because if you're trying to keep everyone happy, it pays politically, at least for a while, short term, to start dishing money out to various groups. You hand money out to favored contractors. You give lots of welfare to poor people to keep them happy and keep them voting for you. You spend money, you dish money out across the economy, money that you don't really have. And so one of the things that started to emerge in Sri Lanka in the last 15 years was very large budget deficits, spending much more than you could take in on tax revenue. South Africa's been doing that since 2009 as well. And when you start doing that, it seems okay, because you're just starting to borrow. You've got space on your balance sheet to borrow. But of course, if you keep going into debt over and over again, every year you go into more and more debt, and you start building up a huge debt pile. And then what Sri Lanka started to do was they started to borrow money from overseas. They started to borrow in dollars. Now, when you borrow in dollars, you have to pay back in dollars. And if you're earning rupees or rands, and the rand weakens, it makes it really hard to pay back dollar debt, right? So it's risky to borrow dollars, and Sri Lanka borrowed a lot of dollars over the last 10 or 15 years. In that process, what they also did was they formed a partnership with China, and China said to Sri Lanka, we can lend you lots of money, and we can invest in your country to build infrastructure, because infrastructure is good. Infrastructure is a good thing, right? Must be good. Infrastructure is always good. We'll talk about how it's not so good, but we'll get there. So China lent a lot of money to Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka borrowed, and they invested a lot of money in infrastructure that they didn't really need. Do we sometimes do that in South Africa? I think so. I think so. Now, some infrastructure is very important, but it needs to be built in a particular way and in a particular process. Sri Lanka went the route of building infrastructure through big, juicy contracts for friends, for buddies, for pals, for family members. Okay? I think we have a little bit of experience of that in South Africa as well. Major infrastructure projects, highly corrupt. An estimate in 2016 suggested that half of every government contract in Sri Lanka was a corrupt contract. I wonder where South Africa stacks up on that scale. Okay, So Sri Lanka was overspending, over-borrowing from foreigners, investing in infrastructure that didn't bring a return because it was wasteful. It wasn't necessary infrastructure, okay? It's like they built a cricket stadium in one part of the country because the Sri Lankans love their cricket, and it's a white elephant. Hardly ever gets used. Okay, we used one of our white elephants last weekend. But we don't often do that. Okay. Now Sri Lanka started to, so we get into towards 2020. Now we all know what happened in 2020. But before 2020, Sri Lanka has a very big tourism industry. And because of its political problems, there was a violent terror attack by a separatist group in Sri Lanka in 2019. And its tourist sector really hit the skids. It really contracted. And tourism in Sri Lanka is a big way to earn foreign revenue. And if you owe a lot of dollars, it's good to earn a lot of dollars. Okay? When tourists come in, they actually spend dollars in your country. They exchange their dollars for your currency. So, Sri Lanka had a major economic shock, or quite a big economic shock, just before the biggest economic shock of all, which was lockdowns. Lockdowns slammed shut the economy, slammed it shut, killed their tourism industry. We saw a very similar thing in South Africa. Our tourism sector died overnight, dead for 6 months. And then it slowly started to claw its way back. And even in 2021, it wasn't able to come out. So Sri Lanka came into 2020 with lots of debt, lots of dollar debt that it owed in dollars. Lots of regulations on its economy, infrastructure that wasn't delivering a return. It wasn't a healthy economic system. And then lockdown came and really basically just pushed it over the edge. Now, how did Sri Lanka respond? And then this is really the key as to why they're in the type of crisis they're in now. How they responded was that they decided to print the money that they didn't have. This is always and everywhere a terrible idea. Don't print money. Money is not to be created out of nothing. Money is to be earned. So the central banks printed the money out of thin air, and they gave it to the government to spend, to pay salaries for government employees, and so on. Now, of course, when governments do that, particularly in small, poor countries, what is the result of printing money? What happens? Prices go up. Because you're destroying the value of your currency, prices start to go up. And prices have started to ramp up dramatically. CPI inflation is 60%. As of the last reading, I suspect now by August it's about 100%, double. Food prices, as I said, have already doubled. Sri Lanka printed money to finance their deficit. Just to put it in numbers that you can maybe sort of get your head around, Sri Lanka printed about 2/3 of its fiscal deficit last year. That would be like South Africa the central bank printing about 250 billion rand and handing it to the government. Just creating it out of nothing, giving it to the government. 250 billion rand to do what it likes. That would obviously be a tremendous threat to the South African rand, to financial stability. But those are the sorts of numbers that we're talking about. Okay, so that brings us to today. Sri Lanka had a currency collapse. Why? Because it printed lots of currency. If someone can just create their currency at will out of nothing, it's going to lose its value. So Sri Lanka also, in this process, because they're getting so desperate, they've decided to ban certain kinds of imports. And last year, to heap on the misery, okay, they banned chemical fertilizer imports. Fertilizers that are not what we would say non-organic, even though everything's organic in a sense. But chemical fertilizers. Now, chemical fertilizers are critical to modern agriculture. They do have environmental consequences, but what Sri Lanka did was say, these chemical fertilizers are so bad for the environment that we're just going to ban them. And they banned them overnight. And Sri Lankan farmers were forced to import organic fertilizers, no doubt through a particular business or contract, set of contracts. No doubt some people got the organic fertilizer contracts. And that came into Sri Lanka. Now, whatever you want to say about the efficacy of organic fertilizers, the fact is that the farmers and their farming methods and their high-yield seeds couldn't cope with organic fertilizers, and the crop yields fell dramatically in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lankan exports, agricultural exports, plummeted, and their food security plummeted. That's one of the reasons why there's hardly any food in Sri Lanka. And of course, they don't let the markets work in Sri Lanka. They put restrictions on what you can import, what you can sell, the price that you can sell things. And of course, finally, Sri Lanka has many inefficient, over-indebted, state-owned enterprises, as I mentioned, okay, including the energy, the electricity company, but there's many others. Okay, so that brings us today. So what are some of the key features that got Sri Lanka to this very terrible crisis that it faces today? I think the main one that you can obviously pick up from what I'm saying is just tremendous corruption. Now, corruption is a word we throw around, but it comes from a debasement of the moral fiber of not just the leadership of a country, but also of its society. Because actually, if you're letting the government control everything, if you're letting them dish out free goods, nothing's really free, you also have a moral deficiency. And of course, the government is there handing out contracts to buddies, spending money it doesn't have. Whose future is it jeopardizing when it does that? The children. Children will grow up to be future citizens of the country and have to shoulder this tremendous debt burden that the government of today has put on their shoulders. But now, we've got to say, man's heart, the heart of man is corrupt. It's prone to corruption. So do we hope for better men and women? I think we should, and I think we should try to get better men and women, but we should also try and create systems so that corrupt hearts can't fully express themselves, okay, that check power, that check misbehavior and corrupt and immoral behavior. And of course, what you've seen in Sri Lanka is a central state that has no challenges to it. We mustn't get into the trap, folks, of thinking that political parties or courts or the parliament keep state power in check. They are all part of the state. And the state doesn't check its own power. The state grows its own power. The state needs something outside of it to check the growth of its own power. Okay? There's no state in the world that gets up every morning and says, how can we be less powerful today? They want to grow their power. So who are the non-state entities that must push back against state power and say, no, you don't get to do this. You don't get to regulate us here. You don't get to change this. We're pushing back. It's civil society organizations. It's the private sector. It's businesses. It's schools, independent businesses. Anything that is outside of the state must draw a line and say, no, you don't have jurisdiction and authority to just destroy our money. You don't get to do that. And if you do that, we're going to use a different kind of money. These are the sorts of things that push back against state power. Sri Lanka's got a very weak civil society. Power was heavily centralized in Sri Lanka. South Africa has a strong civil society. Groups like Sakelige, like AfriForum, like Solidariteit, and many others, not just in the Afrikaans community, but outside, constantly are pushing back at our government. But are things going wonderfully out there? No. And the reason is that civil society is not strong enough. It needs to get much stronger. We need to be focusing much more on much more opposition outside the state towards state power. And that's not going to come from other political parties. That's not going to come from the courts. The courts can help sometimes, but ultimately they are part of that state apparatus. We need to grow the influence of non-state checks on state power. So as we say at the back there, hou staatsmag in toom om besigheid te laat floreer. We've got to keep it in check. So these are the lessons. There's 3 myths that I want to finish on. So we've got to hold state power in check. There's 3 myths that the Sri Lankan crisis has been built upon. The first myth is the myth of infrastructure. You often hear people saying, we must build infrastructure. Infrastructure is what we need. Now, of course, in one sense, that's true. We do need infrastructure. We need energy infrastructure, okay? But you can also build bad infrastructure. If you centrally plan where all the infrastructure must be, often it turns out to be a total disaster. You build the wrong roads, you build the wrong types of infrastructure. The process is corrupt. So we need markets to determine where we need the infrastructure. And often you don't need as much infrastructure as you think. In fact, sometimes when governments build beautiful big new roads into a klein little dorpie, sometimes you think, keep the small road. We don't want that many people there. Let the market decide if it needs a bigger road or not. So infrastructure, and China came in with enormous infrastructure, and Sri Lanka got indebted, and they built bad, unnecessary infrastructure. And you know what China did? When Sri Lanka couldn't pay China back, China have commandeered one of the most strategic ports in Sri Lanka. It belongs to China because Sri Lanka can't pay them back. China has taken it as basically as a kind of collateral. It's taken it as an asset. It's done a debt asset swap, and it now basically runs that port in Sri Lanka. Astonishing. So national sovereignty and of course all these things come under huge threat. The second myth is that you can constantly go into debt. And let me just say this very clearly, guys. National debt, deficits that the government runs, these are a moral scandal. We should not stand for a government spending more money than it takes in tax revenue. It is absolutely ridiculous. It's putting us and our children in debt that they did not ask for, and that is completely unproductive. Borrowing money to pay the salaries of bloated state payrolls, lazy civil servants, is an absolute scandal. The budget should be balanced. Debt should be paid down. There should be no national debt. The next myth is the myth of money printing. You can't print your way to prosperity. Oh man, if we could, it would be lovely. We could print money and we could all be wealthy. You can't create money out of thin air and expect prosperity to follow. It creates misery. It creates hyperinflation. Zimbabwe is on our border. We saw that happen in Zimbabwe from 1999 to 2009. And you know what? Millions of Zimbabweans left that country. So you can't print money. And the one piece of good news is that whilst our central bank does print some money, it's relatively little. It's relatively conservative. It's relatively well behaved. All central banks print money, and it's always wrong. But our central bank is not misbehaving as badly as they are doing in Sri Lanka. And so for now, our currency remains reasonably well protected from that kind of debasement. And one of the reasons is because we have a good, strong, sophisticated financial sector. And in some ways, our banks actually regulate the Reserve Bank rather than the other way around and make sure that the Reserve Bank behaves. But if the central bank gets captured by the wrong politicians and the wrong political faction, it will start printing money, and it will start destroying the value of the money in your wallet, and it will start creating misery and poverty. And one of the things that happens when you print money is you draw wealth towards the money printers. If we could print money in this tent, real rands, we could go out and buy real things. We could be wealthy. So whoever gets the money first, but the guy who gets the money last in the chain of transactions, by the time he's got it, prices have already gone up. He's not richer. So whoever prints the money and can get hold of the money, the cronies and the favored businesses, they get to actually extract wealth towards themselves. And finally, this crisis was precipitated by a collapse in agricultural output because of an ideology that said you can just click your fingers and completely change your agricultural production technology to a completely different type of fertilizer, and everything will be fine. That is classic central planning, okay? You've got to let these processes work slowly. Legacy technologies are there for a reason, and we see this in energy in South Africa. The idea that you can click your fingers and suddenly transform our entire energy system to a wind and solar system, in my opinion, is folly. Maybe we get there one day, but on the process towards getting there, we have to recognize the benefits of coal, of fossil fuels, of natural gas, of petrochemicals. These are incredible inventions and sources of energy that have built the modern world as we know it today. And so that ideology, unfortunately, infected Sri Lanka. I know I'm going over my time, Pete, so let me close by saying that South Africa has elements of what we've seen in Sri Lanka. Corruption, cronyism, favored contracts, debt, permanent debt. Every year the government runs large deficits. Do you know that this year the government will run about a 300 billion rand deficit? It's going to spend about 300 billion rand more than it gets in taxes. Okay? We don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. Okay? Last year it was about 500 billion. Since COVID, our debt has increased by something like 1.5 trillion rand. Enormous, unfathomable sums of money. And who has to pay that back? We do. We didn't ask for that debt, and we have to pay it back. But we also have some good things going for us. We have a central bank that is reasonably well managed. And for now, we have a civil society outside the state that pushes back against the state. It says, no, you're not going to lock us down again. We can't afford that. We can't afford another lockdown. It will break our economy. It will break business. We're going to push back against that. And that's what Sarkalikha is doing. Sarkalikha stands as one of the bricks in that wall. There's many bricks in that wall. We're one of the bricks in that wall. We're building a business community that says, no, we're standing against what you're bringing. We're standing against BEE proudly. We think it's wrong. As Pete says, it's skadelik. Skadelik, so we must oppose it. Okay? We stand against these things, and we push back against the state. We need your help to do that. And whatever sphere you are in, take that mindset of resistance and justice to the over-encroachment of state authority. Not the end of state authority, not the abolition of the state necessarily, but the encroachment of state authority into your sphere. Thank you very much. I hope you've learned some lessons from Sri Lanka. Thank you.